The clean room smelled faintly of antiseptic and champagne. I was Dr. Elara Vance, poised on the edge of discovery. Every sense was alert, every detail etched into my memory. The sterile whiteness of the walls, the rhythmic hum of the ventilation system, the gleam of polished instruments. And yet, it was the small things that betrayed the truth. The way Rhys's hand lingered on the glass, the barely perceptible glance shared with Chen. I had trusted them. I had devoted years of life, intellect, and heart to this laboratory, convinced that the people around me shared my respect for science, for integrity. Rhys, my husband, had been my partner in every sense, guiding, advising, sometimes challenging me, but always, I had believed, supporting me. And Nina, well, she was young, ambitious, brilliant even, but I had treated her like family, mentoring her through her first years. Yet there they were. The security footage confirmed what my instincts had long feared. The final reagent, years of refinement, months of experimentation, poured down the drain, substituted with a worthless imitation. And then the kiss, the smug triumph in Nina's eyes. That intimate betrayal, the mingling of professional theft and personal treachery, hit me harder than any chemical failure could. The champagne in my hand, once a symbol of celebration, was suddenly an instrument of finality. My body betrayed me before my mind could respond. Paralysis crept up my arms, blurred my vision, and I felt the heat and humiliation of defeat seep into my bones. Rhys's voice was close, too close, yet devoid of warmth. Nina provided the perfect distraction, Elara. You and your ethics were always a problem. Now everything is simplified, he said, each word deliberate, cruelly measured. I sank into the sterile floor, the world narrowing into a tunnel of clarity. I saw everything. The stolen data, the destruction of my reputation, the cruel delight on Nina's face. Yet, beneath the despair, beneath the rage and the panic, a seed of determination took root. They could kill my body, but not my resolve. I would ensure their ambition led only to ruin. Their fraudulent careers, their tainted research, would not survive the reckoning I would orchestrate. And then the darkness came. I woke to the familiar scent of old textbooks and the faint tang of ethanol in the university chemistry lab, my body sore, but my mind oddly sharp. I was 20, filled with energy and curiosity, years before the betrayal, before Rhys and Nina had ever touched my life. The date on the calendar was March 10th, 2014. It was ordinary, mundane even, except for the knowledge I carried from a future that had already burned me. I sat at a wooden desk near the tall windows, sunlight spilling across the faded linoleum. Around me, students murmured and shuffled, unaware that history was already rewriting itself. I could smell the chalk dust, hear the scratch of pens across paper, and feel the hum of fluorescent lights overhead. And in the middle of it all, I knew exactly who I needed. Dr. Kael Sharma. He was already here, meticulously reviewing ethical protocols for upcoming student projects. The same man Rhys had always dismissed, ignored, and mocked. The one person in my past who could guarantee that the future I had seen, the ruin, the theft, the betrayal, would never take root. Kael's devotion to principle was quiet, steady, and unwavering. He didn't crave power or recognition. He simply believed in truth. That belief was rare, and it was my weapon. I approached him, careful not to draw attention, careful to hide the trembling hope I felt. I wasn't asking for help in the usual way. I wasn't asking for a favor or guidance. I was bringing knowledge that was impossible, knowledge from a future that had already happened. I had the certainty of a hurricane in my bones. The protocol they're planning for Project Alpha is fundamentally flawed, I said quietly, lowering my voice so only he could hear. It introduces bias that will render all subsequent data invalid. If it proceeds, the results will be meaningless, and those responsible, Rhys and his assistant, will claim it as their own. I need you to enforce an immediate review. Make them redo the process, ensure integrity. Kael looked up, his dark eyes steady and discerning. There was no disbelief, only a cautious curiosity, a professionalism that made my heart race. That's a serious claim. If what you're saying is true, the repercussions are enormous. Why trust you with something so precarious? I hesitated, feeling the pulse of my own history thrumming beneath my skin. I could have given 100 excuses, explanations, even lies, but none would capture the truth of my urgency. Instead, I simply said, because I know, and because the science deserves truth. Not corruption, not theft, not greed. There was a pause, an almost imperceptible moment when the world seemed to hold its breath. Then Kael leaned back, closing the protocol folder in front of him. His expression softened ever so slightly, and I felt the first ripple of relief. He believed in principle, and that belief was stronger than any lie, stronger than any ambition that Rhys or Nina might conjure. Over the following days, we worked side by side in silence, moving with an unspoken understanding. I brought the precise information about the weaknesses in Rhys's intended methods, the invisible cracks in his strategy, and Kael transformed them into unassailable blocks of integrity. Each correction, each enforced standard, was a small victory, a shield against the future I had already lived. And yet, beneath the professionalism, a subtle current began to stir. Kael's presence was grounding in a way that no one else had ever been. His hand brushing mine as he passed a file, the faint tilt of his head when he listened intently to my explanations, the rare but quiet smiles. Each gesture sent a shiver through me I could not dismiss. It was tentative, barely there, but unmistakable. I realized with a startled clarity that he was becoming more than a partner in ethics. He was becoming my anchor. For the first time since that betrayal, I felt a flicker of trust, not just in the work, not just in science, but in a person. And trust, I knew, was a seed that could grow into something profound. Something that would carry me through the storm ahead. The lab was quiet, almost eerily so, as the late afternoon sunlight cast long, golden rectangles across the polished floors. I was alone, save for Kael, who was methodically reviewing the new amendments to the experimental protocols. Each time he moved, I noticed the subtle grace of his hands, the quiet confidence that emanated from his every motion. It wasn't just professional competence. It was the kind of steady presence that made me feel safe, anchored in a world that had betrayed me once already. I leaned against the edge of a workbench, feeling the warmth of the sun on my back, the slight tension in my shoulders slowly unwinding as I watched him. I had expected the work with Kael to be purely strategic, purely about stopping Rhys and Nina. But somewhere along the way, I had begun noticing the little things. The way he paused, thoughtful, before responding to a difficult protocol question. The almost imperceptible way his gaze lingered just a beat too long when I corrected a minor error. The calm cadence of his voice when he explained a complex ethical point. We moved in tandem, without words sometimes. I handed him a document. He passed me a folder. The smallest gestures were electric, fingertips brushing over paper, hands almost meeting at the edge of the table. Every touch, accidental or not, carried the weight of a promise unspoken. A subtle, flirty tension began threading through our days, and I realized that it wasn't just my imagination. Kael's closeness felt deliberately protective, yet there was a quiet invitation in the way he looked at me, the way he let me know I wasn't alone. I pulled a chair closer to his workstation, settling beside him under the pretense of reviewing a protocol together. But I felt my pulse quicken as his elbow brushed mine, as our knees bumped beneath the table. I caught his gaze, and it lingered a second too long, a flash of something private passing between us. The professional distance we maintained was beginning to blur, the boundaries shifting under the weight of unspoken understanding. "You're remarkably precise," he murmured, almost to himself, as he examined the calculations I had prepared for the bias correction. There was no condescension in his voice, only admiration, quiet and steady. My heart fluttered at the rare acknowledgement, not just of my work, but of me, the person behind it. I bit my lip, feeling an almost magnetic pull toward him, the kind of gravity that made every breath and heartbeat sharper, more alive. My fingers brushed against his as I handed him another sheet of data, and for a moment, the entire room seemed to shrink until it was just the two of us, the hum of the ventilation system, and the faint scent of antiseptic fading into the background. "Kael," I whispered, the word trembling on my lips, more from awareness than fear. He glanced at me, the corner of his mouth twitching, an almost imperceptible smile that sent warmth blooming through my chest. That smile, small as it was, held something I hadn't felt in years, the possibility of safety, trust, and something deeper. We continued working side by side, and yet every glance, every shared breath, every brush of hands was laden with tension. I found myself imagining scenarios where the moment didn't end at the table, where I could lean closer without consequence, where the walls we'd built around ourselves for professionalism could crumble just enough to let something new flourish. The afternoons stretched into evening, and the lab's fluorescent lights flickered on, stark against the gathering dusk. Our work concluded for the day, and we stood to leave. For a heartbeat, we lingered, each hesitant, neither willing to break the fragile intimacy that had formed. Then he reached for my hand, not as a gesture of protocol, but as an anchor, a promise, a connection. His fingers wrapped around mine, strong yet gentle. I felt a shiver run through me, the kind that precedes a storm of emotion. And then, before either of us could second-guess it, he leaned in, brushing his lips softly against mine. It was brief, tentative, and infinitely profound, the kind of kiss that carried relief, desire, and a quiet agreement that we would face the future together. That kiss was a promise that the storm I had survived wouldn't define me anymore, not when we could forge something new, something unwavering. As we pulled apart, our foreheads nearly touching, I realized that the work we were doing, protecting the integrity of science, was only part of the story. The other part, the human part, was just beginning. And for the first time in years, I felt something I thought I had lost forever: hope. The lab smelled faintly of ozone and solvent, a chemical perfume that had always grounded me in focus. I lingered near the large bay window, watching the city lights shimmer off the glass. Kael was at the adjacent workstation, methodically checking the latest compliance reports, his presence calm, yet commanding in a way I couldn't ignore. It had only been a day or two since our first kiss, but already, everything felt charged. The air between us hummed with a quiet tension I could no longer dismiss as coincidence. Every brush of his hand against mine, every accidental touch across the bench, carried weight now. Even when we weren't close, his gaze followed me, soft yet unwavering, like a lighthouse guiding me through years of betrayal and uncertainty. I picked up a file to review, pretending to focus on the data. But I couldn't stop noticing how the edge of his sleeve brushed against my arm when he leaned over the monitor. My chest warmed at the contact, my thoughts momentarily scattered. I had always prided myself on discipline, on the ability to detach, but Kael seemed to dissolve my defenses simply by existing near me. "Do you see the pattern here?" he asked, his voice quiet, almost a murmur. I moved closer, deliberately, brushing my shoulder against his. The friction was electric, a small, intimate moment that neither of us acknowledged aloud, but that both of us felt. I nodded, pointing at a line of data, and felt his gaze linger on me, not just on my work, but on me. I swallowed the sudden lump in my throat and forced myself to focus. It wasn't just the closeness that thrilled me. It was the trust. I had spent months navigating Rhys and Nina's calculated deception, always wary, always anticipating the next betrayal. With Kael, everything felt unspoken yet certain. His loyalty wasn't performative. It was absolute, a mirror to the integrity I had nearly lost faith in. And yet, there was something deeper now, threading through our shared purpose, desire. When he adjusted the monitor, our hands brushed. This time, I didn't pull away. I let the warmth linger, subtle and deliberate. He caught my hand in his, holding it for just a second longer than needed, his thumb grazing my knuckles. My pulse quickened, a silent acknowledgement that neither of us was willing to admit aloud yet. The evening deepened, shadows pooling across the lab as the city outside darkened. We continued to work, side by side, but the rhythm of our collaboration had shifted. Every small touch, every accidental lean, felt like a prelude. I noticed how he lingered near me when I reached for equipment, how his hand steadied mine when I bent over a sample. Each interaction, professional on the surface, carried an undercurrent of something far more intimate. I dared a glance at him. His eyes met mine, steady and deep, and a small, private smile tugged at his lips. It was a promise, a shared understanding that we were no longer just colleagues. My breath caught, and I realized I wanted him close, not just for the safety he offered in this cutthroat world, but for the quiet intimacy that felt like home after years of betrayal. Finally, the workday ended. We remained near the benches, neither of us moving to leave. The lab was silent except for the faint hum of the ventilation system. Kael's hand brushed mine again, deliberate this time, and he stepped closer, closing the small distance between us. I leaned into him without thinking, letting the warmth of his body ground me. He rested his forehead against mine, a slow, teasing intimacy that made my heartbeat surge. Our lips met, tentative at first, a soft exploration, but the tension of days, the fear, the betrayal, the trust we had built, made it deepen with urgency. It was a kiss of reassurance, of silent promises, and of desire finally acknowledged. The world outside the lab ceased to exist for those moments, leaving only us and the fragile, exhilarating connection we had found in the aftermath of lies. When we finally pulled apart, our foreheads still pressed together, I whispered, almost to myself, I never knew trust could feel like this. He smiled, the quiet intensity in his gaze promising that we would face whatever Rhys and Nina tried next together, and perhaps, along the way, find something neither of us expected: love. The office felt unusually quiet that evening, the usual hum of computers replaced by the low creak of settling floors and the occasional echo of footsteps outside. I was reviewing the latest project reports, though my mind kept drifting back to Kael. Even in the sterile glow of the lab lights, I could feel the warmth of his hands lingering on mine, the faint brush of his sleeve against my arm, the quiet assurance in his gaze. The memory of our kiss made the rational part of me shiver and the reckless part ache for more. I leaned back in my chair, trying to focus on the numbers and protocols. But my thoughts refused to stay disciplined. Every interaction with Kael since that night felt electric, like a hidden current running between us. Even when he didn't touch me, his proximity spoke volumes. The air itself seemed charged whenever he was near. I caught him from the corner of my eye, reviewing a report across the room. His brow furrowed slightly in concentration, yet his eyes flicked up, meeting mine for the briefest moment. A small, almost imperceptible smirk tugged at his lips. I felt a flutter in my chest, a dangerous, exciting pull. I couldn't remember the last time someone had made me feel both safe and unsettled at the same time. Kael had always been principled, focused, unyielding in his dedication to ethics. But now there was something else there too, something personal, intimate, teasing, and aware of my reaction to his presence. I pushed the papers aside, standing to stretch, and Kael mirrored me across the room. Our movements were slow, almost deliberate, as if we were both aware of the space closing between us. I felt his eyes follow the line of my neck as I stretched my shoulders, and I caught a slight blush creeping up my own cheeks. The tension between us was palpable, unspoken but undeniable. "Rough day?" he asked, his voice low, just above a whisper, yet it carried more warmth than the fluorescent lights ever could. I nodded, my throat suddenly dry, though my mind raced. "You could say that," I murmured, letting the words hang in the air, aware of how close we were now. A single step, and I could feel his chest brush mine. Another, and our shoulders would touch. Every instinct screamed caution, yet every heartbeat urged me forward. He moved slightly closer, just enough that our arms brushed. I didn't pull away. Instead, I let the contact linger, letting him feel the same electricity I did. His eyes softened, a subtle, knowing smile playing at his lips. I wanted to say something, anything, but the words failed me. Instead, he reached for a file on the desk near me, his hand grazing mine in the process. It was a deliberate touch, slow, teasing, yet so intimate that I felt a shiver run through me. I looked up at him, and our gazes locked. The room felt smaller suddenly, as if it existed only for the two of us. The distance between us seemed charged with unspoken confessions, shared trust, and a desire that neither of us had dared to name aloud. I tilted my head slightly, an invitation, a small, daring move. He leaned in, and I could feel the warmth of his breath against my cheek. His hand found mine, this time holding it firmly, deliberately. I felt my pulse spike. The room faded entirely. There was no lab, no projects, no deadlines, just the two of us suspended in a moment of fragile, thrilling intimacy. Then, slowly, tentatively, he pressed his lips to mine. The kiss was soft at first, testing the waters, but it deepened quickly, as though every day of tension, every threat from Rhys and Nina, and every quiet glance over documents had led to this. It was a kiss of trust, of desire, of recognition. I melted against him, letting the heat of the moment consume me, savoring the safety and passion in his arms. When we finally parted, our foreheads rested together, breathing mingling. I whispered, almost against my own disbelief, "I've never felt this before." He smiled, eyes dark with intensity and warmth. "Neither have I," he murmured, letting our hands remain intertwined. "And yet, somehow, it feels like it was always meant to be." For the first time in months, maybe years, I felt the weight of betrayal lift slightly, replaced by something steadier, something real. In Kael's presence, the chaos of Rhys and Nina, the paranoia, and the deceit seemed distant. And as we stood together in that quiet lab, I realized that some battles could be won not just with intellect or foresight, but with trust, and maybe, just maybe, with love. The lab was unusually still that morning, the kind of silence that made even the faintest hum of a monitor seem deafening. I was Elara, navigating the aftermath of Rhys and Nina's latest attempt at deceit. But my attention was far from the spreadsheets and experimental protocols. It was on Kael. The thought of him lingered like an invisible tether, his steady gaze, the warmth of his hand when it had brushed mine, the subtle curve of his smile when he thought I wasn't looking. I moved through the lab methodically, checking equipment, confirming data logs, and keeping a watchful eye out for any signs of Rhys's schemes. Yet, even in the midst of professional diligence, my mind returned to him. How close had he been last night when our hands met across the bench? How deliberate had his touch been, and how much had I let myself lean into it? Kael entered the lab without announcement, the soft click of his shoes against the tiled floor catching my attention. He stopped beside me, arms crossed loosely, the faintest tilt of his head suggesting curiosity or amusement. I couldn't quite tell which. His presence alone seemed to draw the air in tighter, making the room smaller, more intimate. I felt my pulse quicken, my thoughts scattering despite the careful control I prided myself on maintaining. "Early start?" I asked, trying to sound casual, though my voice betrayed a faint tremor. He glanced at me, eyes bright, and gave a subtle nod. "The morning's quiet. Perfect for strategic planning," he said, the words carrying double meaning, though I wasn't sure if he realized it himself. The corner of his mouth lifted in a small, teasing smirk. I felt a flush rise to my cheeks, refusing to retreat despite my usual composure. Our workstations were side by side, but that morning, every movement seemed to carry weight beyond practicality. When I reached for a notebook, our hands brushed deliberately. The contact lingered, a fleeting connection that spoke more than words ever could. I stole a glance at him, and he met my eyes, just long enough to send a thrill of awareness through me, then returned to his task, pretending professionalism. But professionalism was fragile. It cracked under the tension that had been building between us, the quiet, simmering undercurrent that neither of us could entirely ignore. I felt his proximity, the subtle scent of his cologne, the warmth of his presence radiating toward me. Each glance, each brief touch of a shoulder or an elbow was electric, charged with anticipation and unspoken desire. As the hours passed, we moved around each other with quiet synchronicity, an unspoken rhythm forming. I found myself leaning closer to hear his low murmurs over my shoulder, the brush of his hand accidentally, or intentionally, against mine sending shivers up my spine. The flotation was subtle, a dance of restraint and temptation that both thrilled and unnerved me. At one point, I felt his gaze linger, sharp and assessing, as if he could read every secret thought I dared not voice. I caught my breath, heart hammering, and he finally broke the tension with a small, deliberate smile. "You're thinking about last night," he said, soft enough for only me to hear. I let my lips twitch into a half-smile, pretending annoyance, though inside I was floating. "Maybe," I admitted, voice quiet but steady. The air between us seemed to thicken, charged with a magnetic pull that made distance impossible. Then, he leaned in slightly, the space between us shrinking until our foreheads almost touched. His hand brushed against mine, fingers tracing a subtle path along the edge of my notebook, a small, daring gesture. The intimacy was unspoken but absolute, a private language between us. My breath caught, and I realized how much I had been longing for this. Someone who saw me, trusted me, and matched my intensity not with ambition or manipulation, but with unwavering integrity. Kael's eyes softened as he searched mine, and the quiet words he didn't speak resonated deeply. Trust, care, desire. And when he finally pressed his lips to mine, it was gentle, a teasing prelude that promised more, a kiss that spoke of protection, of shared victories, and of something delicate yet undeniable. I melted into him, letting the tension, the lingering betrayal from Rhys, and the exhaustion of constant vigilance dissolve in that brief, perfect connection. When we pulled back, just enough to breathe, he rested his forehead against mine. "We'll face this together," he murmured. "All of it." And in that moment, I believed him, not just as a partner in science, but as someone who could anchor me in a storm I'd long feared unending. The lab lights flickered faintly as I entered, carrying a stack of data reports. Even the sterile smell of disinfectant and chemical solvents felt comforting compared to the storm of thoughts in my mind. I was Elara, navigating a delicate balance between protecting our research and keeping Rhys and Nina from exploiting every weakness. But my focus was no longer solely on the lab, it was on Kael. Every glance, every subtle touch lingered longer than it should, making concentration a challenge. Kael was already at his workstation, reviewing protocols with his characteristic intensity. His brow furrowed, lips pursed, but there was a softness around his eyes when he looked up at me. A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, and the tension in the room, normally so rigid and professional, thinned into something warmer, almost tender. I placed the reports down beside him, careful to brush my hand against his as I did. He didn't pull away. Instead, his fingers lingered near mine, close enough that I could feel the faint heat radiating from him. My pulse quickened, a mixture of anticipation and the subtle thrill of rebellion against the rigid control of the lab. "Morning," he said, voice low, deliberately casual. But the way his eyes held mine spoke volumes, and I felt a shiver of something dangerous and wonderful crawl along my spine. I tried to focus on the data, but every time I looked at him, every small movement, the way his hair fell across his forehead, the tilt of his head when he considered a line of figures, made it impossible to think solely of work. It was as if the air between us had become a conduit, charged with electricity, pulling me closer despite the professional walls we had tried to maintain. At one point, he reached for a pen on my side of the desk, and his hand brushed mine again. This time, the contact was deliberate. I caught his gaze, and the faintest spark of amusement danced there. He raised an eyebrow, a silent challenge, and I felt heat rise to my cheeks. I let my hand stay near his, letting the closeness linger, drawing strength and courage from it. Minutes stretched, and every movement, every glance, was a quiet negotiation. I found myself leaning slightly toward him, drawn by the warmth and steady reassurance he radiated. The subtle flirtation, unspoken and restrained, pulsed between us, an electric current that neither of us could deny. Then, in the midst of reviewing a particularly tricky protocol, he leaned closer. The scent of his cologne mingled with the sterile lab air, and I caught my breath. His hand moved, brushing a loose strand of hair from my face, fingers lingering against my cheek. My eyes fluttered closed for just a moment, savoring the contact, the intimacy that had been building for weeks. "You're incredible," he murmured, almost as if testing the sound of the words. "I don't just mean your work. I mean everything you bring to this." I opened my eyes, meeting his, and for the first time, the weight of the lab, of Rhys's betrayal, of Nina's schemes, seemed distant. It was just us, suspended in a moment that was both thrilling and terrifying. My lips parted slightly, and he leaned in closer, his forehead brushing against mine. The warmth, the tension, the promise in his gaze, it was intoxicating. Our lips met in a slow, deliberate kiss, tentative at first, but building with the intensity of all the unspoken words and lingering touches that had come before. I pressed closer, letting myself melt into the embrace, the kiss deepening as if it were a release of weeks of stress, fear, and longing. His hands were gentle but firm, anchoring me, grounding me, and promising that we would face everything together. When we finally pulled back, slightly breathless, our foreheads still pressed together, he whispered, "Whatever comes next, we'll handle it side by side." And in that fragile, perfect moment, I believed him. The fight with Rhys and Nina could wait. For now, it was just us, just this connection, real, honest, and unwavering. I was Elara, finally standing on the precipice of justice and reclamation. Weeks of careful planning with Kael had brought us here, a comprehensive dossier of evidence exposing Rhys and Nina's fraudulent research, meticulously documented and verified. Every step had been deliberate, every precaution taken. This time, there would be no surprises. Kael stood beside me, calm but alert, reviewing the final checklist of documents before submission to the ethics board. His hand brushed mine as he passed me a stack of printouts, and I felt that familiar warmth spread through me. The small, lingering touches, the silent communication we had developed over the months, it was a language of trust, a silent promise that we were in this together. I thought back to the moment I had discovered Rhys and Nina sabotaging my work, the betrayal that had felt like a knife twisting in my chest. Every step since then, waking up in the past, working with Kael, blocking their advances, had been a calculated reclamation of my life and my integrity. And now, finally, the moment of reckoning was at hand. We submitted the evidence, and within hours, the internal review board began their inquiries. The weight of anticipation pressed against me, but Kael's presence at my side was steady, unshakable. His quiet confidence and unwavering belief in truth made it impossible to succumb to fear. Every time I glanced at him, every time his fingers brushed mine or his eyes held mine for a fraction longer than necessary, I was reminded that this fight was no longer mine alone. The confirmation came late in the afternoon. Rhys and Nina's primary grants were frozen pending full investigation, and their attempts at misappropriation were fully documented. The relief was a tidal wave, and I could feel it in my bones. The betrayal that had once paralyzed me was nullified, the threat extinguished by our foresight and unwavering ethics. Kael leaned close, his breath warm against my ear. "You did this," he murmured. "Every step, every decision. You saved the science, and you saved yourself." His hand found mine, fingers intertwining with a familiarity that felt like home. I let myself exhale fully for the first time in months, sinking into the reassurance of his presence. The quiet intensity between us had grown over time, from shared late nights to whispered strategizing, to subtle touches that lingered a second too long. It wasn't just relief, it was connection, trust, and something far deeper. Without thinking, I stepped closer, drawn by the magnetic pull that had been building since the beginning. Kael's hand rose to cut my cheek, his thumb brushing lightly over my skin. I felt the steady, grounding warmth of him, the way he made all the chaos seem manageable. And then, finally, I kissed him. It was slow at first, a gentle assertion of presence and trust. But as the tension of months, the betrayal, the fear, the endless planning, melted away, the kiss deepened, full of longing and recognition. His hands moved to cradle my head, his touch firm and protective, while I pressed into him, letting the moment carry us both beyond the lab, beyond the chaos, into a space of pure intimacy and trust. When we finally pulled back, foreheads resting together, I could see it in his eyes: admiration, relief, and a profound, unwavering affection. "We did it," I whispered, voice trembling slightly. "Together." He smiled, the first truly unguarded smile I had seen from him. "Yes, together. And nothing can take that from us." In the weeks that followed, Rhys and Nina's fraudulent activities were fully exposed. Their careers faltered, while the integrity of our work remained intact. Kael and I strengthened the ethics protocols, ensuring that such deceit could never take root again. But more than that, our bond, built on trust, respect, and unwavering moral conviction, blossomed into a love grounded in the very principles we had defended. Years later, we led the world's most respected ethical biotech firm. Every day, I looked at Kael and saw not just my partner in work, but my partner in life. The betrayal that had once threatened to destroy me had led to this: a partnership built on integrity, love, and a shared commitment to truth. And when he kissed me that evening, the sun casting a golden glow across the lab windows, I knew that this was a bond that could withstand anything, ethical, personal, or otherwise. My life, finally, was anchored in unwavering trust, and in him,